Hello, this is a part of a series of setting up a basic server using Esxi and a Windows domain controller and some clients and using group policy, just general basic networking stuff. The reason for doing this is I've met several people recently and started talking to them about Windows Server, and well, I was quite astonished about how interested they were in how Windows Server worked and how group policy worked, and also quite pleased with how easy it was to convey how stuff works and how to set up a very basic set of group policies, how DHCP works, and other things to do with Windows Server. So I thought, why not attempt to put this into a YouTube video and possibly a YouTube video series and see if other people benefit from it. So I'm going to download or these days really having a server just installed with Windows Server is not a great idea. You limit, especially if you've got a really high spec server, how much you can do with that server. So virtualization, so Microsoft's Hyper-V, or the one I prefer is VMware's Esxi, is a really good way of running multiple machines or multiple servers on one bit of hardware. So if you are installing a server, I strongly recommend learning Esxi and or possibly Hyper-V and virtualizing your environment. It also means if your hardware goes wrong or you need to move it to a better or even a worse server, you can just copy over those virtual files to another server with Esxi on it and register those files on that server and then press start, and your server's just moved over. You don't have to do a load of hardware reconfiguration and drivers and everything. It just works. So what you need is a USB memory stick. So I have one here which I've just plugged in. It's currently got Windows Server install media on it, but that will all get blown away when we write the Esxi installer to that USB stick. So my server at the moment is totally blank and I need to put an operating system on it, and I'm going to start with Esxi. So I'm going to Google for Esxi free and click the first result, which, watch out, make sure it's not the advert one if there is an advert. So it's the one at VMware.com. Top right hand corner of that is a download now button, so I'm going to click on that. It will almost certainly ask me to log in. Yes, please log in. So you can just create an account under that option. I've already created one, so I'm going to log in. So now I've logged in, I'm going to scroll down on the download page, and there is the most recent version of VMware. It also gives you the older versions as well if for some reason you wanted to download that. Also, just a quick note, and I'll see if I can do that while it's downloading. If you have a fairly recent Dell server or HP server, or possibly some other brands of big brands of server, you might want to download VMware from their website. So with Dell, you go to support.euro.dell.com, you fill in the service tag and click on drivers and downloads. In drivers and downloads, you select Esxi and then the version, or VMware Esxi and the version, and it will give you a pre-configured ISO file, so where I'm getting just the stock ISO file from direct from VMware.com. If you go via Dell or HP for the specific server you have, you'll get one which has stuff built in to monitor the hardware of the server, so it could possibly monitor your RAID card, the temperatures in the system and other stuff like that, whereas the stock VMware image might not have that ability built into it. In the case that I'm doing for this video series, I have a Dell PowerEdge T1102, and that's so old that the most recent Esxi which Dell provide is version 5.5, which is a very long way from the 6.7 version that you can get from VMware, or direct from VMware. So that has downloaded. We now need to put it on the memory stick. It isn't as simple as just copying that file to the memory stick. So I need to, or you would need to go to Google again and download Rufus, R-U-F-U-S, and then I'm going to put USB on the end as well. Go to rufus.ie download Rufus and run it. Select the memory stick that you want to put the Esxi installer onto. Click on the select button, and in the downloads folder I've got that one file I've downloaded, the 6.7 VMware installer. Most of these being set to default is absolutely fine, and just click on start. I think for each of these I've always clicked yes to this. I don't think it breaks anything. Whether you do yes or no, it'll probably still work anyway, but I will click on yes to do the update from the internet. All the data on my USB stick will be wiped. That's absolutely fine. Let's click on OK. And there we go, that is now done, so I can click on close and the Rufus software will go away. It's very important that you safely eject the USB stick, so in Windows you need to click on the little USB icon in the system tray and click on eject, because not always is data flushed out to the USB until you do that. So if you unplug the USB stick very soon after completing a write or writing the ISO using Rufus, there's a small chance that some of the data won't have actually been written to the memory on the memory stick. So ejecting flushes or forces all that data to go to the memory stick so that it is, in quotes, safe to unplug. So the next thing I'll do is plug this into the server and talk you through installing it. Right, here we go. So I'm going to put the USB stick which I've created into the server. And I do apologise about this filming. It's going to be shaky and horrible. I don't really have any tripod or anything for my camera to go on. So here goes. Let's turn on the server. And go over to the screen and keyboard. So I need to press the correct key to run a temporary startup device when I get the option. F11, boot manager. Right, so this is in BIOS mode. If you have the ability, UEFI is a much better idea. So I'm going to swap over to UEFI and then select the memory stick which I've plugged in. I do have an unsupported memory configuration, so that's fine. I'm going to press F1 to continue. And the Esxi installer will now run, and will take a while to get to the initial prompt. So, ready to install. Going to press enter to continue. and read through the license agreement, which I've seen many times before, so F11 to agree to that. So I've got a set of hard disks which are on the RAID controller, and then I've got a an SSD, Kingston SSD, which I'm going to install Esxi onto, because I'm going to use the hard disks for data storage and the SSD for operating systems. So operating systems will be quick and responsive and start up, whereas data storage, which doesn't need to be particularly quick, can be on the much higher capacity hard disks. So press enter on the Kingston drive. And important here, because if you're installing this on an existing server or you've got drives plugged in which have existing data on it, if you select this drive it will wipe the drive. So make sure that you have backed up anything you need and know that the drive that you're about to install onto isn't required for anything. So I'm going to go yes to that, because this is my testbed server or my lab server. There's nothing that I need on it, so I can wipe that. I'm going to select the correct keyboard layout for me and give it a password. I'm going to call it 0 shell, which is going to be the same as the lab environment router that I've got, so keep it all the same, 0 shell. Oh, doesn't contain enough characters, so I'm going to put an exclamation mark on the end. We'll see how much I have to type in until it allows it. Maybe a capital Z or Z for the Americans. Still doesn't like it. Ugh. 0 shell 1 exclamation mark. Ah, there we go. That's good enough for it. That's fine. It's basically saying that my hardware, which is just this lab environment, is end of life basically, and virtualization is not enabled, which probably isn't, so I'll go into BIOS in a minute and enable that. On any modern system, or especially server hardware, virtualization will be enabled, or should be enabled by default. I'm actually quite surprised that it allows me to install it with virtualization disabled. And the other week I tried to install it on an AMD machine and it wouldn't even let me install it at all, just said entirely unsupported processor. Right, that's installed, so unplug the memory stick and then press enter and it will reboot. And this bit you can probably skip past if you want. It'll be me going into the BIOS to enable virtualization. Virtualization enabled. There we go, fantastic.
And there we have it. That's Esxi installed and started, and that's all you see, really. You shouldn't really, other than maybe shutting down or rebooting the system, you shouldn't need to do anything at this screen, unless you wanted to configure it with a static IP address, possibly. But you can see it's picked up from my router a DHCP, or a dynamic IP address, of 192.168.0.100, and the rest of it we will now continue from a computer. Just as a quick note, if you leave the console for a while, it will lose the yellow bar at the bottom and it will go black and white, as you can see there. That's nothing to be worried about, that's what it does. It's almost like a screensaver.
Okay, now probably good for everyone. We're back onto a screen sharing or screen recording, and not using my phone to record a video of a screen. So as you saw, it was installed, it has an IP address on the network. So now if I go to that IP address, bypass the certificate error, and you'll get the Esxi login screen. So the default username is root, and the password, which I chose earlier, was 0shell with a capital Z, and I think it was 1 exclamation mark, if I remember correctly. I don't want to join the experience improvement program, which basically feeds back information to them. Don't really want to do that. And there we go. That's your Esxi installed and ready to take some guest operating systems. This screen gives you information about the system, how much resources are being used, how much processor and hard disk capacity or throughput are being used. By default, you won't have a valid license installed. That is really simple. In the same VMware download screen where you downloaded VMware, if you scroll up, there is your free Esxi key. If not, Google for free VMware Esxi key and go to the vmware.com result and you sign in, and it will just assign you a key, which is good for, I think it's 2 physical processors, or there's some limit where if you have really beefy hardware it's not going to be suitable and you have to pay for Esxi, but for most small networks it will be absolutely fine. So what you want to do now is get a server operating system ready to install. If your server has a CD or DVD drive, then you could just do it by putting the DVD into that, creating a virtual machine and booting off of the physical drive. Most servers these days don't come with physical CD drives or DVD drives, so you would want to upload an ISO or an install image to the VMware server. So I'm going to go to storage and go to the SSD storage, click on browse data store, and there's nothing there basically. At the moment there's no virtual machines, there's also no install ISOs. So I create a directory normally called ISO files, go into the ISO files directory and then upload. And I'm going to go to my downloads folder, and here's one I prepared earlier, the Windows Server 2019 install ISO. So I downloaded that from the MVLS or Microsoft Volume Licensing website. Click on open and it will now upload that ISO to the Esxi server. I'm only on 100 megabit network, so it's going to take quite a while here. So I'll go away and we'll resume this video once the ISO file has uploaded to the Esxi server. It looks like we're getting towards the end of the file upload. There we go, that's done. In the ISO files folder we now have the Windows ISO. I can close that. So now we're ready to create the virtual machine. I'm going to click on Virtual Machines, Create a brand new virtual machine, and I'm going to call it Domain Controller Lab. Guest family is Windows, and we can now select Windows Server 2016. If you're running an older version of Esxi, it's possible that you won't have newer operating systems in your guest operating system list, but that's just the way the world goes. Quite often you can still use the older version in the guest version selection and still install a new Windows operating system. I don't want to expose virtualization onto that guest operating system, so I'm just going to click on Next. I'm going to store it on the SSD for my operating system side of it, and I think this machine has 24 gigs of RAM, so I'm going to start with, let me just double check, yep, 24 gigs of RAM. I'm going to give it 10 gigabytes of RAM, why not? That's fine for the CPU. I've only got one CPU, apparently with only one core in that processor, so I'll just have to live with one CPU, one core. And storage space, I'm going to give it 60 gigabytes on the SSD, which will leave me roughly 60 left for the two Windows 10 machines. And then the rest of it, other than the CD drive, you can leave default. CD drive, we want to do a data store ISO file, which is the file that we uploaded earlier, the Windows install DVD. And then next, finish. That's now created a virtual bubble or a virtual machine within your Esxi server. So if you click on it and then click the play button, you should get essentially a computer within your web browser. Oops, I didn't press any key quick enough. So power, so in there, actions, power, actions, power, reset. And I'm going to click in there, and then when it asks me, I'm going to press any key. There we go. So within Esxi on the server, so we're all doing this remotely, the server behind me is now working away, doing stuff, but it's sending me the screen using the web browser, and Esxi is sending it to me, which is really convenient. So all you really need to do is get Esxi installed and online, then the rest of the operating systems and everything else you can administer from elsewhere, as long as you've got network connectivity to it, which is really, really useful. So I want the desktop experience of Windows Server, because the standard one doesn't give you the desktop experience, it just gives you the PowerShell command line, which is good for system resources and possibly security, but for new people managing a Windows Server is not a good idea. So the next option I selected there was I didn't want to do an upgrade install because there's no operating system there, so I went to custom install, and there's my 60 gigabyte partition within Esxi, so I'm going to install it onto that 60 gigabyte area. And while that installs, just drag that out of the way, if you click on Monitor, you get lots of graphs about CPU usage and memory usage. So I've just started that virtual machine, suddenly it's using the 12 gigs of RAM that I've assigned it. And again, if you had lots of them and lots starting and stopping at different times, you'd see all that memory usage changing. Network usage, that was me uploading the ISO file. And then disk usage, which again will be me uploading the ISO file. And then over here we've got me starting to install Windows within that virtual environment, which is all quite useful information. So that'll take a while. I'll stop this video and we'll come back once that's installed. So Windows has finished installing and has just gone into the reboot phase. Again, while it's doing all of that, let's go here and refresh the graph of hard disk usage. And CPU usage. And there we have it. That's Windows Server installed within your Esxi environment. And set a password. I'm going to do the same one: 0 shell 1 exclamation mark 0 shell 1 exclamation mark. So with this screen, you need to do Control-Alt-Delete to unlock, which if you do that, you'll be doing it in your web browser and it'll just make your own computer bring up the security options. So to do it in the guest operating system, you need to click on Actions, move the mouse down but don't click on Guest OS, go across to Send Keys, and then go across and then click on Control-Alt-Delete, and that sends through the web browser the Control-Alt-Delete to the guest operating system. So one of the first things you probably want to do once you've got your operating system installed is install VMware's Guest Tools. So under Actions, do Guest OS and install VMware Tools. That basically puts in a fake CD drive into the operating system, a bit like when we installed Windows from the Windows Install ISO. And if you go to this PC, the CD drive will now contain the VMware Tools. And it's 64-bit, so I want to run the setup 64. What VMware Tools allows for is extra communication between the guest running within VMware ESXi and ESXi itself. So from the web browser you could tell the guest operating systems do a clean shutdown and all sorts of other things. It also installs the graphics, well, in theory, the graphics drivers, so that if you resize this browser window here, the operating system follows that size, which is quite useful and quite easy to resize Windows and guest operating system screen sizes. And there we go, you can see it's already resized itself to the size of the window that I had. So if I take this and drag it to be wider, the whole of the guest operating system fills to take that space, which is pretty good. It did ask me to restart, so I will restart. And that's pretty much it. Just like that, in hopefully less than an hour's worth of video. I don't know how long it'll be once I've edited it up. That's you downloading VMware, putting VMware onto a memory stick, chucking the memory stick into a server, installing VMware on that server, uploading the Windows ISO to VMware, installing Windows, and then you have a fully working Windows server on your new virtual machine host. And the next steps we will have will be converting this Windows server to be a domain controller, joining computers to that domain, doing DHCP, doing DNS, doing group policy and some other things, hopefully, when I get around to it. Hope this video has been really helpful. If it has been helpful to you, the best thing you can do for me is if you wouldn't mind subscribing. It doesn't matter whether you have the alerts switched on or not, just having the subscriber count is really useful for YouTube. So hopefully this has helped, and if you've got any things you want to know how to do in small networks and domain networks and Windows Server, please do comment it, because I'm just going to do the stuff that I think is useful, so group policy, DNS, etc. There might be something I've overlooked that you really want to know how to do, or would be really helpful or easy for me to make a video on how to do it. Thank you, have a good day and good luck. One further quick addendum, which is if your VMware machine, your actual entire server, gets rebooted, your virtual machines by default will not automatically start up. So you would get this user interface, but they would not start, the guest operating systems would not start up automatically. To do that, you need to go for each of your virtual machines. So when you add a new virtual machine, you need to remember to do it. You need to go Actions, AutoStart, and then click on Enable. Just doing it there is not good enough. You also then need to go to Manage, AutoStart, Edit Settings, and then click on Yes. And that means that when you've power cycled your VMware server, after 2 minutes it then starts up the guest operating systems. So if there's a power cut, or if you've had to reboot it for some reason, you don't have to log on to the interface and start your guest operating systems. Just one thing to be aware, that there are 2 places that needs to be enabled. It needs to be enabled in the Host Manage AutoStart section, and it also needs to be enabled for each of your guest operating systems on VMware.